He had tried for 4 years to make that beast answer to him. She hadn't even been trying. From the high window of his study, King Kalen watched the girl cross the muddy yard, her movements economical and quiet, and felt the familiar cold weight of failure settle in his gut. It was a private, bitter thing, this failure. The manticore, Forelag, was a creature of myth and brutal reality, a symbol of a throne he held by the thinnest of threads. Its refusal to be mastered was a whispered indictment in every corner of his court. And this girl, a scullery maid with dust on her skirts and hands, raw from lie, had accomplished in a single afternoon of soft-spoken words what he, with all his authority and force of will, could not. He watched until she disappeared into the kitchens, then turned from the window. The silence in the study was absolute, a pressure against the ears. He did not move for a long time. When he finally spoke, the command was soft, but it carried the chilling finality of a closing crypt. "Bring her to me." The summons came like a blade in the dark. Alara was scrubbing a great copper pot, her mind blessedly empty, when the captain of the royal guard appeared in the kitchen doorway. His armor gleamed impossibly clean in the steam and grime. The other servants froze, their fear a sudden stink in the air. Ilara did not. She finished her motion, a slow, deliberate scrape of bristles against metal before setting the brush down, the sound of the brush being set down carefully on stone. She rose, wiping her wet hands on her apron, and met the captain's gaze. She had been in this castle for 6 months and had learned its primary law. Notice was a death sentence. To be seen was to be vulnerable. And she, it seemed, had just been seen by the king himself. The walk to the king's private wing was a silent journey through the castle's cold heart. The stone floors bled the chill up through the thin soles of her shoes. Tapestries depicting his ancestors' kings who had ridden dragons and commanded legions watched her with woven, impassive eyes. They looked nothing like him. The stories told of a lineage of fire and noise. Kalen was a king of silence and shadow. The guards outside his study did not announce her. They simply opened the heavy oak doors and gestured her inside, their faces like stone masks. The door closing in the distance. The room was a cage of books and maps, smelling of old paper and beeswax. A single fire burned in the hearth, a tame and lonely thing that did little to fight the encroaching dusk. He stood by the window, the same one he had watched her from, his back to her. He was a tall man, built of long lines and coiled stillness. He did not turn. "They say you spoke to it," he said. His voice was not what she expected. It was quiet, a low resonance that seemed to be part of the room's oppressive silence rather than a break in it. "I spoke," she answered. Her own voice was rough from disuse. "It is not the same thing." He turned then, and she understood why people feared him. It wasn't his crown or his sword. It was his eyes. They were the color of a winter sea, and they saw everything she had built, her life around hiding. He looked at her, not as a king looks at a servant, but as a predator assesses an unknown creature that has wandered into its territory. Vorlog has killed 3 handlers, men trained since birth to manage beasts of war. He has broken every chain and shattered every gate put before him. What did you say that they did not? Alara held his gaze, her fear a cold, hard stone in her stomach. But her face gave away nothing. She had learned that lesson long before she came to this castle. I told him he was not alone. Scalen's expression did not change, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. A flicker of something she could not name. Annoyance, disbelief, Perhaps something sharper passed through those cold eyes. He had expected a trick, a secret word, a hidden scent, a bit of hedge witchery. He had not expected this simple, impossible truth. He walked slowly toward her, his boots making no sound on the thick carpets. He stopped an arm's length away, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from him. You will be moved to the muse. You will tend to him. You will learn what he is, and you will show me. It was not a request. It was a sentence. He was not rewarding her. He was putting a leash on her, tying her to the one thing in this world as dangerous and unpredictable as himself. And if I refuse? The question was out before she could stop it. A spark of the defiance that had kept her alive. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a chilling, humorless thing. "No one has ever refused me and lived to speak of it," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But I have a feeling you would be the first to try." He looked past her toward the fire. "Do not—" The new quarters were a small, clean cell, carved out of the thick stone wall of the mews. It had a cot, a wash basin, and a single high window that looked out not at the sky, but at the iron-barred enclosure where Vorlag was kept. Alara was a prisoner, and the beast was her warden. She spent the first day in silence, watching. Vorlag was magnificent and terrible. Larger than a warhorse, he had the body of a lion, the wings of a dragon, and a tail tipped with a cluster of venomous spines. He paced his enclosure relentlessly, a storm of contained violence. The air around him crackled with rage and despair. The other stable hands gave the enclosure a wide berth, their fear a palpable wall she had to push through every time she approached. They spoke of her in whispers, a mix of awe and suspicion. The beast charmer, the witch. She ignored them. Her focus was on the creature. She did not see a monster. She saw a prisoner, just like her. She saw the same raw wound of loneliness that she carried inside her own chest. On the second day, she brought a bucket of water and set it just outside the bars. She did not try to get closer. She simply sat on a low stone bench, her back to the wall, and waited. Hours passed. Forlag ignored her, his pacing unabated. The sun began to set, painting the stones in hues of blood and rust. Finally, his relentless motion slowed. He stopped, his great head turning toward her, his eyes, molten gold, fixed on her. They were not filled with mindless rage. They were intelligent, ancient, and filled with a pain so profound it stole her breath. She did not speak. She did not move. She simply met his gaze and let him see her. Let him see that she was not afraid, not of him. She was afraid of the king, of the court, of the cage. This place was slowly building around her. He took a hesitant step toward the bars, then nigh. The soft scrape of massive claws on stone. He lowered his head, sniffing at the water bucket. Then, his gaze still locked on hers, he drank. It was a truce, an understanding that passed without a word. She was not his master. She was his witness. And in this kingdom of silence and secrets, that was a far more dangerous thing to be. Seelan watched from the shadows of the upper gallery, a place built for him to observe the training yards unseen. He had been there all day. He saw her stillness, her impossible patience. He saw the moment the beast yielded, not to a command, but to a silent offering of communion. It was a language he did not speak, a power he could not comprehend. And it was unfolding in his own yard, a quiet rebellion against the very nature of his rule, which was built on control, on fear, on the unbreachable distance between himself and all other living things. He had wanted to possess the beast's power. This girl was simply letting it exist. The difference was vast and terrifying. He felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang in his chest. It was not anger, it was something closer to envy. Her presence in the mews shifted the balance of the castle. Power, she was learning, was not always loud. Sometimes it was the quiet confidence of a girl who could walk into a monster's cage and walk out again, unharmed. The whispers followed her like shadows. The Lord Regent, Valerius, was a man made of whispers. He was older than the king, had served his father, and moved through the court with the silent, unobtrusive deadliness of a spider. He found her one morning as she was cleaning Vorlag's enclosure, the great beast lying placidly in the straw nearby, watching her with those intelligent golden eyes. "A remarkable gift," Valerius said, his voice a smooth, polished stone. He stood just outside the gate, his fine robes unblemished by the grime of the mews. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were like chips of obsidian. "The king is pleased. He has sought such a bond for years." Alara continued her work, pitching soiled straw into a wheelbarrow. She did not look at him. The beast decides for itself. "Indeed," Valerius murmured, his smile tightening. "That is what is so concerning. The old prophecies speak of the House of Salem. They say its right to rule is tied to the great beasts, that only a true heir can command their loyalty." He let the words hang in the air, each one a carefully placed weight. He was not speaking to her. He was speaking for the benefit of the guards who stood behind him, for the stable hands who had paused in their work to listen. He was crafting a narrative, and she was its unwilling centerpiece. "A scullery maid with no name accomplishing what a king cannot," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "It makes one wonder about the nature of a true heir, about where the gods have truly placed their favor." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a finely honed blade laid gently against her throat. She was no longer just an anomaly. She was a political weapon, a symbol that could be used to legitimize or more likely to delegitimize the silent man who sat on the throne. She finally stopped turning to face him. Her hands were steady on the handle of the pitchfork. "I serve the king," she said, her voice flat and cold. Valerius's smile widened. It was a predator's smile. "Of course you do, child. We all serve the king. The question is which king?" He gave a slight bow and departed, his guards falling into step behind him. The silence he left behind was heavy and foul. Vorlag made a low sound in his throat, a rumbling growl, and nudged her hand with his massive head. He understood. He had always understood the language of predators. Later that day, Salen came to the mews. He did not need to. He simply watched her as she groomed the manticore, her hands moving with a steady, practiced calm through the coarse, dark fur. He stood just inside the enclosure, a place no other man dared to enter. Vorlog tolerated his presence, but his eyes never left the king, a silent warning. "He sheds," Ilara said, holding up a handful of dark fur. It was a useless observation, a small, mundane stone thrown into a deep well of unspoken tension. "All beasts do," Kalen replied, his gaze fixed on her hands. "Valerius believes you are a miracle, or a heresy. He has not yet decided which will be more useful to him. And you?" she asked, her voice quiet. "What do you believe?" He was silent for a long moment. He looked from her to the beast, and for a fleeting second, his mask of control slipped. She saw something raw and unguarded in his eyes, a flicker of the same profound loneliness she saw in Vorlag. It was so unexpected, so shocking. that she almost dropped the brush. "I believe," he said slowly, his voice barely audible over the rustle of the straw, "that you are dangerous." He was not talking about her connection to the beast. He was talking about the way she looked at him, as if he were not a king, but a man, as if she could see the cage he had built around himself. And that, she realized, was the most terrifying power of all. A storm broke that night, a violent, unseasonable tempest that threw rain against the stone walls like handfuls of gravel. The wind howled through the crenellations, a mournful, angry sound. Thunder cracked the sky, and the castle, usually so still, felt as if it were under siege. Elara was woken by the sound of Vorlag's distress. The beast was on his feet, agitated, his wings half unfurled as he paced the confines of his enclosure, the lightning flashing off his dark scales. She pulled on a simple tunic and boots and went to him, unlatching the gate without a thought. The wind and rain lashed at her as she stepped inside, but she ignored it. She spoke to him in low, soothing tones, her hand resting on his powerful neck. She felt the tremors of his fear pass through him. He was a creature of the sky, and to be caged during a storm. The great wooden door to the mews groaned open, and King Kalen stepped inside, shaking the rain from his dark cloak. He was alone. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his face, illuminated by a sudden flash of lightning, was stark and grim. He had come to check on the beast, or perhaps he had come to check on her. He stopped when he saw her inside the enclosure, her small form, a point of calm in the center of the manticore's frantic energy. He did not speak, simply watched as she murmured to the creature, her touch gentle but firm. The storm raged outside, but inside the small space they occupied, a strange quiet fell. Forlag's pacing slowed, his wings folding back into place. He leaned his great weight against her, a gesture of absolute trust. Kylan walked closer, stopping just outside the bars. The rain dripped from his hair onto the stone floor, the sound of a single drop of water hitting stone, then another. "You are not afraid of the storm," he stated. "It was not a question. It is only weather," she said, her eyes still on Vorlag. "It will pass. And him?" Kalen gestured toward the beast. "He is a storm that will not pass." "He is not the storm," she corrected quietly. "He is the one trapped inside it." Kalen fell silent. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, she felt his gaze not as an assessment, but as a search. He was looking for an answer to a question he didn't know how to ask. He saw the faint, silvery line of a scar that traced the back of her right hand from the knuckle to the wrist, an old wound, long since healed, but visible in the flickering lantern light. The unspoken question hung between them, more intimate than any touch. The storm outside began to recede, its fury spent. The thunder softened to a distant rumble. The only sounds were the dripping water and the soft, heavy breathing of the manticore. In that small, quiet moment, surrounded by stone and storm and a creature of myth, the walls between them became thin, almost transparent. He was a king who had forgotten how to be a man, and she was a girl who had never been allowed to be a child. They were two prisoners staring at each other through the bars of their respective cages. "The council meets at dawn," he said finally, his voice rough. "Valerius will speak of prophecies. He will use you as his proof." He turned to leave, his cloak swirling around him. At the door, he paused. "Be careful, Elara." It was the first time he had used her name. The sound of it in his mouth was both a comfort and a warning. It meant he saw her and in this castle, to be seen was to be in mortal danger. The whispers in the court grew into a low, incessant murmur. Valerius was masterful. He never accused the king of anything directly. He simply expressed concern. He spoke of the health of the kingdom, the importance of tradition, the worrying silence from the gods. And in every speech, he would mention the miracle in the muse, the humble servant girl blessed with the divine touch that their king so conspicuously lacked. He painted Alara as a saint, a vessel of a higher power, and in doing so, he turned her into a target. Every glance from a courtier was a judgment. Every polite nod from a lady-in-waiting was a veiled threat. They did not see a girl who was kind to a lonely animal. They saw an alternative, a challenge to the cold, silent man who ruled them through fear rather than affection. Ilara felt the net tightening. She continued her duties, her face a mask of placid indifference, but inside, the old instinct screamed, the instinct to run, to disappear, to become so small and quiet that no one would ever notice her again. One evening, Kalen summoned her not to his study, but to the battlements. The sun was setting, bleeding across the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. The wind was cold and sharp, whipping her hair across her face. He stood staring out at the sprawling lands of his kingdom, his hands gripping the cold stone of the parapet. "They are afraid of you," he said, without looking at her. "They are afraid of what you represent." "I represent nothing," she said, her voice sharp. "I am a servant." "You were a servant," he corrected, finally turning to face her. His eyes were dark, shadowed by the fading light. "Now you are a symbol, and symbols are more powerful than kings. They can be used to start wars." He held out a small, heavy leather pouch. It clinked with the sound of gold. "There is a horse saddled in the west stable. It is fast. No one will stop you. Ride north. Do not stop until you are beyond the Frostfang Mountains. Find a new life. Forget this one." It was not an offer of kindness. She knew that. It was a strategic move, a king removing a problematic piece from the board, but it was also something else. A test? He was giving her the escape she had craved, the freedom she thought she wanted. He was giving her a choice. She looked at the pouch in his hand, then back at his face. She saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the immense weight he carried in his unbending posture. She saw the prisoner in the cage. If she ran, she would save herself. But he would be left alone, surrounded by the spiders and their webs. Valerius would win. The silence in the castle would become permanent, a tomb. She thought of Vorlag, of the trust in his golden eyes. Leaving felt like a betrayal, not just of the king, but of the beast, and of the strange, fragile understanding that had grown between the three of them. "And what will you do?" she asked. "When I am gone, and Valerius uses my absence as proof of my witchcraft and your weakness?" "I will endure," he said, his voice flat. "It is what I do." She shook her head. She did not take the gold. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Running is what I used to do. I will not run from this." A flicker of surprise, of something she could not decipher, crossed his face. He had expected her to take the gold. The entire world had taught him that everyone acted in their own self-interest. Her refusal was a disruption to the fundamental laws of his universe. He slowly withdrew the pouch, his fingers curling around it. "Staying is a death sentence, girl. Then I will die here," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "But I will not die alone in the dark." For the first time, the silence between them was not a void. It was a choice, a pact made without promises, an alliance forged in the cold wind on the edge of the world. He had offered her a way out, and she had chosen to stay in the cage with him. Now they would play it together. Valerius's machinations grew bolder. The accidents began a snapped cinch on the king's saddle. During a hunt, a mislabeled vial of herbs from the apothecaries, close enough to the king's own stores to be a clear message. They were small, deniable acts of aggression, designed to unnerve and isolate. Kalen moved through it all with his usual unnerving calm, but Alara saw the toll it was taking. She saw it in the way he held himself, a little more rigid than before, and in the deepening shadows under his eyes. One afternoon, she found him in the armory. Long after the training sessions had ended, he was alone, stripped to the waist, methodically cleaning a long sword. A fresh, ugly gash ran from his shoulder, down his ribs, crudely stitched, and seeping blood. A training spar, the guards had whispered. One of Valerius's men had gotten overzealous. Seelan looked up as she entered, his eyes narrowing. He made no move to cover the wound. It was a statement in itself, a display of strength, a refusal of vulnerability. Alara ignored the sword. She carried a small wooden bowl containing a poultice of comfrey and euro, the same mixture she used on Vorlag when he scraped a wing or cut a pad. The quiet sound of a ceramic bowl being set on a wooden table. She said nothing, simply set the bowl down on a nearby table along with clean linen bandages. He watched her, his hand still on the hilt of his sword. The air was thick with the smell of steel, oil, and blood. "I do not require a nursemaid," he said, his voice a low growl. "I am not a nursemaid," she replied, her voice even. "But that is a fool's stitchwork. It will fester." She picked up a clean cloth and dipped it in a basin of warm water. She approached him slowly, as she would approach a wary animal. He did not move, but every muscle in his body was coiled tight. He was watching her, waiting for her to flinch, to show fear. She did not. She stopped before him and gently, firmly, began to clean the edges of the wound. His skin was cold, despite the heat of the forge in the corner. He hissed as the cloth touched the raw flesh, an involuntary sound of pain that he immediately suppressed. She worked in silence, her movements efficient and impersonal. But the act itself was devastatingly intimate. Her fingers brushed his skin. She could feel the heat of his blood, the violent thrum of his heart beneath her hand. This was the man beneath the crown, the flesh and bone beneath the armor of silence. He had been alone for so long. He had forgotten what it felt like to be touched without demand, without supplication. He had forgotten the simple human act of care. When she was done cleaning the wound, she applied the cool, soothing poultice. He did not flinch this time. He simply watched her face, his expression unreadable. She wrapped the clean linen around his ribs, her movements sure and practiced. The scar on her own hand was stark against his skin. He could have stopped her at any moment, a word, a gesture, and she would have been gone, but he did not. He let her tend to him. He let her see his weakness. For a man like Seelan, this was a more profound surrender than laying down his sword. When she finished, she gathered her things. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she hoped he did not see. "The herbs will draw the fire from it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She turned to leave. "Alara?" His voice stopped her. She paused at the door, her back to him. "The scar," he said, "on your hand." She did not turn around. "A reminder," she said softly, "from a man who thought a cage was the only place for something he could not control." She left him then, alone in the armory, the scent of her herbs mingling with the smell of his blood. The wound on his side was a secret they now shared, a bond forged not in words, but in shared pain. It was a secret Valerius could never hope to understand. The Lord Regent, sensing his subtle attacks were failing, decided on a final public gambit. He invoked an ancient right, a relic of a more brutal age, the right of command. A monarch whose legitimacy was in question could reaffirm their divine right by demonstrating absolute mastery over one of the great beasts. It was a spectacle, a piece of political theater designed to be a perfect trap. Valerius announced it before the full court, framing it as a joyous opportunity for the king to silence the treasonous whispers and display the power flowing through his veins, a power now clearly shared, he added with a magnanimous smile, by the blessed hands of his humble servant. Calin had no choice but to accept. To refuse would be an admission of failure, a confirmation of everything Valerius had been insinuating. The demonstration was set for 3 days' time. The entire court would gather in the great yard. Ilara would bring Vorlag forth, and the king would command him, but they all knew who the beast truly answered to. If Ilara gave the command and Vorlag obeyed, it would prove her power, not Kalen's cementing her as the true vessel of divine favor. If Seelan gave the command and Vorlag refused or worse, attacked, it would shatter his authority beyond repair. And if Alara refused to participate, she would be branded a heretic and a traitor, and Kalen would be forced to execute her himself. There was no way to win. The night before the rite, Seelan came to the Muse. The air was cold and still. Vorlog was quiet, resting in the straw. But his golden eyes were open, watchful. "He has played his last card," Kalen said. He stood near the enclosure, not looking at her, his profile a stark silhouette against the moonlight slanting through the high window. "This is not a test of power. It is an execution, staged as a ceremony." She was braiding small, protective charms into Vorlag's mane, a habit from a life she had tried to forget. Her hands were steady. "Tomorrow," he continued, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "When you bring him into the yard, I will give the command. He will not obey me. Valerius will call for your arrest. The crowd will demand a verdict. Do not speak. Do not resist. Let the guards take you." Elara's hands stilled. She looked up at him. "You would let him win?" "He will not win," Kalen said, a dangerous edge to his voice. "He will have shown his hand. In arresting you, he will overstep. He will become the tyrant he claims I am. It will give me the cause I need to act, to remove him and the council with him, permanently." She stared at him, the cold reality of his plans settling over her. He would let them take her. He would use her as bait. He would sacrifice her on the altar of his throne, all for the sake of a political victory. It was a sound strategy, was ruthless. It was the move a king would make, and it shattered the fragile trust that had grown between them. "You would let them condemn me," she whispered, her voice hollow, "to save your crown." He finally turned to look at her, and in the pale moonlight, his face was a mask of torment. "I would let them condemn me," he corrected, his voice raw, "for the chance to save you from the pyre myself. It is the only way. Trust me." But trust was a fragile thing, and hers had been broken too many times before. She looked away from him, back to the beast at her side. She had made a mistake. She had allowed herself to see a man in the cage when she should have only ever seen the king. The day of the rite dawned, gray and breathless. A scaffold had been erected for the royal court at one end of the great yard. The silence of the gathered crowd was a living thing, heavy and expectant. Valerius stood beside the empty throne, his face a mask of pious solemnity. He was savoring his victory. Kylan entered and took his place. his expression carved from stone. He did not look at Alara as she led Forlag from the mews. The manticore was calm, his steps measured and silent, but the air around him vibrated with power. He was a king in his own right, and he knew he was the center of this human drama. Alara walked him to the center of the yard and stopped. She did not look at Kalen. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at Valerius, and for the first time, she let him see the cold fury in her eyes. Kalen's voice rang out, unnaturally, loud in the silence. A single sharp word of command in the old tongue, the language of beasts and kings. Kneel. Forlag did not move. He stood immense and indifferent by Alara's side. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Valerius's smile was triumphant. As we feared, he began, his voice ringing with false sorrow. The divine right has passed. The beast does not know its master. Seize the witch. The guards started forward. Kalen's plan was unfolding exactly as he had said. She was the bait, and the trap was about to spring. But as the guards approached, Alara did something no one expected. She did not wait to be taken. She did not look to her king for salvation. She took a deep breath, and she laid her hand flat on Forlag's flank. She did not give a command. She did not speak a word. She simply sent a silent message through her touch. Trust me. Then she turned her back on the beast, on the guards, on the entire spectacle, and walked toward the throne. It was an act of impossible faith. To turn your back on a manticore was suicide. Valerius's jaw dropped. Kalen rose slowly from his throne, his eyes wide, fixed on her. Forlag did not attack. He did not move. He simply watched her go. Then, with a grace that defied his size, the great beast lowered himself to the ground, not in a kneel of submission, but in a posture of rest. He laid his head on his paws, his golden eyes following Alara, and waited. He had not obeyed the king's command. He had obeyed her silent request. The display of power was absolute, undeniable, and entirely hers. She had not just won the game, she had shattered the board. She stopped at the foot of the dais and looked up at Kylan. Her face was calm, her resolve absolute. She had refused his plan, refused to be his pawn. She had offered him a different path. Not a victory won through sacrifice and bloodshed, but through a quiet, devastating act of trust. The choice was now his. The yard was so quiet she could hear the blood pounding in her ears. Valerius stood frozen, his perfect trap sprung on himself. He had built a narrative of her power, and she had just proven him right in a way he could never have imagined. He was ruined. Kylan looked down at her, and in his eyes she saw not a king assessing a subject, but a man witnessing a miracle. He had built his reign on control, on the principle that all creatures could be broken, chained, or bent to his will. She had shown him a power that did not command, but connected, a power he had never known. He slowly descended the steps of the dais until he stood before her. The crowd held its breath. They expected an accusation of witchcraft. He reached out, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he would strike her. Instead, his fingers gently brushed her cheek, a touch so light it was barely there. It was an answer, an acceptance, a surrender. He turned to the stunned court, his hand falling to rest on the hilt of his sword. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the yard. "The rite is concluded," he said. Later, the castle was still. The court had dispersed in a state of shock and confusion. Valerius had been taken to the dungeons, his political career ending not with a bang, but with the quiet closing of an iron door. Alara stood in the king's study, The fire was burning, the books were in their places, but the oppressive silence was gone. In its place was something new, something breathable. Kylan stood by the window, looking out at the dark yard where Vorlag now roamed free. The gate to his enclosure left wide open. He did not speak for a long time. Alara waited. She had learned the value of his silences. This one was different. It was not a wall. It was an open space. "For 4 years," he said, his back still to her, "I saw him as a key, a weapon to secure my reign, a symbol to be mastered." He turned from the window. The mask was gone. His face was unguarded, and the vulnerability she had only glimpsed before was now laid bare. "You never saw a symbol," he said. "You saw him." It was the truest thing anyone had ever said to her. He walked to the great oak desk that dominated the room. On it lay a single object, a simple leather lead, the one used to guide Vorlag. It was worn from use, a plain, functional thing. He picked it up. He did not offer it to her as a king bestowing a gift upon a subject. He held it out to her as an equal, an offering, a question. She did not take it. Instead, she reached out and gently closed his fingers around it, then placed her hand over his. His hand was cold, hers was warm. The leather was a bridge between them. The warmth spread from her hand to his, a slow tide against a long winter. It was not a promise of love, not a declaration of a future. It was something quieter and perhaps more profound. It was a beginning. The start of a new silence, one they would share.